It began as a promise of power, a statement carved in steel and ambition. In the aftermath of World War I, the Royal Navy faced a challenge: how to maintain supremacy on the oceans when new battleships and naval strategies were emerging across the world. Among all the proposals, one design stood out, audacious and monumental, meant to be the ultimate symbol of British naval might. That design became the HMS Hood, a ship whose very name would later echo with awe, fear, and tragedy. She was not built merely as a vessel, she was built as a legend in waiting, intended to dominate the seas and inspire a nation still recovering from war's devastation. The Hood's conception was rooted in the lessons of the Great War. Naval architects knew that speed and firepower were crucial, but so was psychological presence. A ship that could intimidate opponents before even firing a shot had value beyond the battlefield. The Admiralty demanded a vessel capable of matching any foreign battleship, while retaining enough agility to respond to fast-moving threats. Early plans called for a combination of heavy armament and remarkable speed, a combination that would require engineering innovation unlike anything seen before. Designers debated endlessly over every detail, from the arrangement of turrets to the thickness of armor plating, each decision balancing between offensive power and defensive resilience. Laid down at the John Brown and Company shipyard in Clydebank, Scotland, in 1916, Hood's construction was a marvel of industrial capability. Thousands of tons of steel were cut, shaped, and riveted together. Workers labored day and night, aware that the outcome of their work would determine Britain's maritime supremacy for decades. Unlike previous battle cruisers, Hood's design incorporated lessons learned from the Battle of Jutland, where speed often saved ships, but insufficient armor proved fatal. The engineers aimed to create a vessel fast enough to chase down enemy cruisers, yet strong enough to withstand hits that had destroyed her predecessors. This delicate balance defined every curve of her hull, every layer of armor, and every inch of her towering superstructure. When she was launched in 1918, the world's largest warship had entered the water. Hood's sheer size was staggering. At over 42,000 tons fully loaded, she dwarfed almost every contemporary battleship. Her length of nearly 860 feet and towering deck structures made her an imposing figure even at a distance. The ship's silhouette alone was a psychological weapon, meant to project the might of the Royal Navy across every ocean. Inside, her main guns, 8 15-inch turrets capable of firing shells over 20 miles, were arranged to maximize firepower without sacrificing stability. Secondary batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and torpedo defense systems complemented her offensive capabilities, creating an almost perfect storm of potential destruction. But Hood was not merely about raw power. Speed was essential, and her engineers pushed the limits of naval propulsion. Equipped with Brown Curtis steam turbines and fueled by coal and oil, she could achieve speeds exceeding 31 knots, making her faster than most battleships of her era. This speed allowed her to dictate the terms of engagement, a key principle in naval doctrine at the time. The combination of size, speed, and firepower made Hood the embodiment of the Royal Navy's philosophy: control the seas through presence, intimidation, and superior technology. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Hood served as the flagship of the Royal Navy, a living symbol of British maritime dominance. She visited ports across the globe, from the coasts of South America to the Far East, projecting the empire's reach. Her appearance at ceremonial events and naval reviews drew awe and admiration, reinforcing the image of Britain as a power that could command the oceans. Sailors who served aboard her spoke of her massive decks, the echo of her engines, and the disciplined precision of her crew. For many, she represented more than steel and guns. She was the pride of a nation, a moving fortress that carried both history and hope on her vast hull. Yet even as she impressed the world, Hood was not invulnerable. Naval warfare was evolving rapidly, and by the late 1930s, aircraft, submarines, and newer battleship designs were changing the calculus of maritime strategy. Hood had been designed after World War I standards, and while her guns and speed remained formidable, her armor especially on her decks was vulnerable to the heavier shells and advanced targeting methods of modern warships. Admiralty engineers attempted upgrades, reinforcing sections of her deck and improving fire control systems, but the core design, constrained by her size and speed requirements, left her susceptible to certain types of attack. Even so, the Royal Navy believed that Hood's presence alone could deter aggression, relying on her legacy and psychological impact as much as her firepower. Despite these limitations, Hood's operational history during peacetime was extensive. She participated in fleet exercises, convoy protection, and training maneuvers, constantly serving as a benchmark for other ships. Her presence influenced naval tactics, forcing potential adversaries to reconsider engagement strategies. Hood was faster and more imposing than many contemporary battleships, and her ability to project power globally made her a strategic asset. Her reputation grew not just from her size and guns, but from the stories that circulated among sailors and officers, tales of her endurance, speed, and the meticulous discipline of her crew. By the eve of World War II, Hood was more than a ship, she was a symbol. When war broke out in 1939, she became the focal point of Britain's efforts to contain German naval ambitions. Every sailor knew that Hood carried not only the weight of her guns but also the expectations of the Empire. She was sent to intercept German raiders, escort convoys, and participate in fleet actions designed to maintain control of the North Atlantic. Her legacy, however, carried both inspiration and danger. The ship's prestige made her a prime target for enemy forces seeking to strike a psychological as well as a physical blow. The story of Hood's birth and early career is a tale of ambition, ingenuity, and national pride. From the drawing boards of naval architects to the shipyards of Scotland, from ceremonial reviews to global deployments, Hood embodied the ideals of British naval dominance. Yet within her greatness lay vulnerabilities that would one day turn pride into tragedy. Every rivet and steel plate, every engine and turret, contributed to a machine that was both a marvel of engineering and a mirror of its era, capable of astonishing speed and immense firepower, yet bound by the limitations of the time in which she was created. HMS Hood entered the world as a promise of invincibility, a floating fortress designed to impress and intimidate. But the sea is a realm of uncertainty, and even the mightiest of creations are tested by forces beyond human control. The legacy of her birth would set the stage for the defining moments of her life: encounters with modern adversaries, the test of battle, and the ultimate sacrifice that would etch her name forever into naval history. The pride and vigil of the seas. The world had changed since HMS Hood first slid into the waters of the Clyde. The roaring enthusiasm of her launch had quieted into disciplined routine, and yet her presence remained unmistakable. Across every ocean she sailed, Hood was not just a ship, she was a statement, a symbol of Britain's reach and of the Royal Navy's enduring prestige. By the 1920s, Europe was in uneasy peace. Governments were rebuilding, empires were reorganizing, and the seas, once scarred by global conflict, now shimmered with the calm of routine commerce. Amid this fragile calm, Hood patrolled with silent authority, her decks echoing with the steady footfalls of sailors who understood that they served not only a ship, but a legacy. Throughout the interwar years, Hood's schedule was relentless. She participated in fleet exercises that tested both strategy and endurance. Massive convoys were escorted, from the icy reaches of the North Atlantic to the warmer waters of the Caribbean. These missions were as much about visibility as they were about tactical training. Every port visit, every ceremonial salute, reinforced the image of a ship too vast and too powerful to be ignored. Civilians and military officers alike marveled at her scale, her 8 15-inch guns, and her sweeping deck that seemed almost endless. Hood's fame spread far beyond naval circles, becoming an icon of national pride, a tangible reminder that Britain still commanded the waves. Yet behind the public spectacle, engineers and officers worked tirelessly to maintain the vessel's edge. Naval technology was advancing at a pace that demanded constant adaptation. Hood underwent periodic refits, where portions of her armor were reinforced, anti-aircraft defenses updated, and fire control systems modernized. Though she remained one of the fastest ships afloat, the designers faced difficult compromises. Increasing armor weight could slow her, while boosting firepower risked destabilizing her balance. Each decision was a calculation of power versus agility, protection versus speed, a tightrope walk that would define her effectiveness in the years to come. The crew, too, were carefully trained to operate this floating fortress. Life aboard Hood was regimented, a choreography of precision and timing. Sailors practiced drills for every conceivable emergency, from battle engagements to engine failures. Gunnery teams refined their aim over weeks, learning to anticipate the arc of shells at extreme distances. Navigation officers studied the shifting winds and currents of the Atlantic, ensuring the ship could maneuver with the grace of a predator stalking unseen prey. Every man aboard understood that Hood was more than the sum of steel, steam, and weaponry. She was a tool of influence, capable of shaping events merely by her movement across the oceans. During these years, Hood's reputation extended far beyond her physical presence. Intelligence reports, foreign observers, and rival navies all took note. Germany, Japan, and other maritime powers measured their battleships against her, calculating whether their own vessels could match her firepower or evade her reach. The ship's psychological impact was profound. A fleet planning exercise, a blockade, or even a simple patrol could influence enemy movements without a single shot being fired. Hood's role was as much strategic as it was tactical, demonstrating that naval power often relied on perception as much as on engagement. However, the specter of obsolescence was never far behind. Naval treaties in the 1920s and 1930s imposed limits on displacement and armament, attempting to curb a growing international arms race. Hood, already immense, represented both the apex and the problem of this era. She was unmatched in size and capability, yet the threat of newer battleships, faster, more heavily armored, and technologically advanced loomed on the horizon. The Admiralty constantly monitored developments abroad, tracking advancements in German, Japanese, and Italian shipbuilding. Each report of a new battleship, or a naval innovation like improved armor-piercing shells, reinforced the understanding that Hood's supremacy was relative, never absolute. In the mid-1930s, as tensions in Europe simmered, Hood began to transition from ceremonial grandeur to operational readiness. She took on training exercises that simulated wartime conditions, coordinating with destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. Crew members drilled under simulated attack scenarios, learning to respond to high-speed engagements and to anticipate threats from both surface and air. Every maneuver, every gunnery calculation, prepared Hood for the reality that the next conflict would be unlike the last, more lethal, faster, and global in scale. It was during this period that Hood gained her reputation for speed and responsiveness. Her engines, meticulously maintained, could push her past 31 knots of velocity that allowed her to outmaneuver slower battleships while maintaining a barrage of accurate gunfire. During exercises, she often led convoys or intercepted enemy vessels in training simulations, demonstrating a blend of endurance, firepower, and agility that few could match. Officers praised her ability to combine long-range artillery strikes with swift tactical repositioning, while historians later noted that this combination made Hood a formidable adversary despite her age. Yet even in moments of triumph, cracks in her armor, both literal and metaphorical, began to show. Designers had long debated the adequacy of her deck protection. While Hood's belt armor could repel shells aimed at her sides, plunging fire from longer distances could penetrate her upper decks, where vital magazines were located. By the late 1930s, this vulnerability became more concerning as intelligence revealed German ship designs and the destructive power of modern naval artillery. Officers acknowledged that Hood was magnificent, but perfection remained elusive. She was a masterful instrument of naval dominance, yet not invincible. As Europe edged closer to war, Hood's role shifted yet again. She became not only a symbol of national pride but a strategic tool in the Royal Navy's contingency planning. Reports from the Admiralty placed her at the center of potential convoy protection operations, patrols to monitor German fleet movements, and as a deterrent against any surface engagement that could threaten Allied shipping. Her presence in the Atlantic was both a practical and psychological statement. Britain's ability to defend its maritime interests remained formidable, even against growing threats. By the outbreak of World War II in 1939, HMS Hood had transitioned from ceremonial flagship to war-ready sentinel. Her guns were loaded with practice shells in peacetime exercises, but now every sailor knew that they might soon face live combat. The massive vessel that had once represented prestige and pride now carried the weight of survival, duty, and expectation. She was still the fastest and most iconic battlecruiser of the Royal Navy, but the world had changed around her, and her glory would soon be tested against an adversary designed with modern warfare in mind. The pride of Britain was poised on the edge of history, her decks echoing with anticipation as the shadow of global conflict loomed ever closer. The hunt and the chase. By the spring of 1941, the Atlantic had become a theater of tension, teeming with invisible threats. German commerce raiders and U-boats preyed on convoys, striking supply lines that Britain could scarcely afford to lose. Each loss of cargo, each sunken vessel, was a blow to the Empire's lifeline, and the Admiralty's attention turned increasingly toward eliminating the threat at its source. Among the most pressing concerns was the German battleship Bismarck, a new leviathan whose sheer firepower and modern design dwarfed most vessels the Royal Navy could bring to bear. Intelligence reports hinted at her movement from Norwegian waters into the North Atlantic, a calculated risk by the Germans to disrupt Allied shipping. The call for action was clear: intercept and neutralize this menace before it could wreak havoc. HMS Hood, still the pride of Britain, was summoned to join the operation. Alongside her sailed the newly commissioned Prince of Wales, a battleship whose modern armament complemented Hood's imposing firepower. For the sailors aboard Hood, the orders were both exhilarating and ominous. They had trained for decades, participated in exercises, and projected naval supremacy across oceans, but now they were facing a battle against a technologically superior opponent. For the first time, Hood's legendary speed and firepower would be tested not in maneuvers or simulated drills, but against a real and lethal adversary. The journey to intercept Bismarck was arduous. Hood and Prince of Wales steamed through icy northern waters, braving heavy seas that rocked the ships violently. Sailors worked in shifts, enduring freezing spray, deafening engine hum, and the constant threat of mechanical failure. Officers mapped out potential engagement points, calculated ranges, and reviewed contingency plans, knowing that even the smallest misstep could be catastrophic. Every sailor understood the stakes. The Atlantic was a battlefield where mistakes were punished instantly, and the enemy they pursued was a nightmare of steel and firepower. On the morning of May 24, 1941, the two British ships sighted the German pair, Bismarck and Prinz Eugen. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a cold, grey light across the restless waters. The first sight of Bismarck's massive silhouette struck awe and fear into even the most seasoned sailors aboard Hood. The German battleship was not merely large, she exuded menace, a floating fortress bristling with deadly intent. Prinz Eugen, smaller but no less dangerous, accompanied her, ready to exploit any weakness. Officers on Hood exchanged grim nods, the moment for which they had trained their entire lives had arrived. The engagement began almost immediately. Hood opened fire with her main batteries, the massive 15-inch guns thundering in unison, shells screaming across the water toward the German ships. Smoke and flame erupted from the turrets, each salvo a statement of British might. Yet Bismarck, modern and precise, returned fire with devastating efficiency. Observers on Hood noted the arcs of the German shells, the deadly accuracy that few battlecruisers had faced before. The sea seemed to explode around them, each impact a jarring reminder of vulnerability despite Hood's legendary stature. Then, in a fraction of a moment, disaster struck. One of Bismarck's shells found its mark on Hood's aft magazine. The ship shuddered violently, a roar that felt larger than the sea itself tearing through her decks. Sailors were thrown to the floor, equipment smashed, and alarms blared. Hood's immense form, which had dominated the oceans for over 2 decades, responded not with defiance, but with fatal inevitability. The explosion ripped through the rear section, splitting the hull like paper. Water surged in, steel twisted, and in less than 3 minutes, the ship Pride of Britain slid beneath the icy waves of the Denmark Strait. The scale of the loss was incomprehensible. Of her 1,418 crew, only 3 survived. Their escape was miraculous, as most had been thrown into the freezing waters without any chance of rescue. The surviving sailors' accounts described the suddenness of the explosion, the deafening roar, and the eerie silence that followed once the ship vanished. Shock rippled across the Royal Navy. Hood, the symbol of Britain's naval dominance, had been destroyed in a single devastating moment, her presence erased from the waters she had long ruled. The immediate aftermath aboard Prince of Wales was chaotic. Officers struggled to maintain order, firing back at the Germans while simultaneously attempting rescue operations that were nearly impossible. The crew was shaken, fear, anger, and grief mingled as they maneuvered in treacherous waters. For many, the reality of Hood's destruction challenged the very notion of invincibility. A ship that had embodied speed, firepower, and prestige had succumbed in minutes, demonstrating that even the mightiest creations had limits. Back in Britain, news of the sinking hit the public like a thunderclap. Newspapers printed the tragedy in stark headlines: Hood lost in battle with Bismarck. Families awaited confirmation, only to be met with grim statistics. Parliament convened emergency meetings, and the Admiralty immediately ordered a full-scale pursuit of Bismarck. The loss of Hood transformed the mission. No longer was it merely about neutralizing a threat to convoys, it became a mission of vengeance and necessity. Every available ship, reconnaissance plane, and naval officer was mobilized to track, intercept, and destroy Bismarck before she could escape into the Atlantic and continue her campaign of destruction. The pursuit itself became legendary. British forces, fueled by determination and outrage, scoured the North Atlantic, coordinating air reconnaissance and naval intelligence. Even as the waves rose and storms battered ships, the mission never wavered. Signals intercepted from German communications, sightings from scouting aircraft, and painstaking calculations of speed and course allowed British forces to close in. Hood's sacrifice had galvanized the Royal Navy, transforming shock into relentless pursuit. The memory of the men lost, the pride of the ship itself, and the fear of allowing Bismarck to escape coalesced into a single driving force: action. By May 27, 1941, Bismarck was finally cornered. The Royal Navy, relentless in pursuit, engaged her in a series of coordinated attacks. Aircraft from the carrier Ark Royal crippled her steering, while battleships and cruisers closed in to deliver the finishing blow. Bismarck's might was formidable, her guns still deadly, but Hood's destruction had underscored a critical lesson: the Atlantic was no longer a realm of intimidation alone, it required coordination, technology, and resolve. The German battleship was sunk, and while justice had been delivered in strategic terms, the cost of Hood's loss remained a somber shadow over the victory. HMS Hood's final battle became a symbol of both human bravery and the harsh realities of naval warfare. Her loss illustrated the dangers of underestimating technological advancement, the vulnerability of even the most prestigious ships, and the unpredictability of combat. Sailors and officers across the Royal Navy reflected on her history, her construction, her speed, and her firepower not merely as tools of war, but as elements of a legacy that inspired awe, loyalty, and, ultimately, profound grief. Even as the waves closed over her remains, Hood's story continued. Her name became legend, whispered in naval traditions, commemorated in memorials, and studied in naval academies as a lesson in courage, strategy, and sacrifice. The mighty Hood had fallen, but her legacy would endure far beyond the icy waters of the Denmark Strait, a reminder that greatness can inspire, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The fall and the legacy. The morning air in the Denmark Strait was sharp and biting, carrying the smell of salt and cold that clung to every surface. For HMS Hood, it was a day like no other. The mighty vessel, whose decks had hosted generations of sailors and whose guns had thundered across oceans, was poised against the German juggernaut, Bismarck. The tension aboard was palpable. Officers and crew moved with practiced precision, hearts steady but minds aware that the next hours could decide the fate of the ship, the lives aboard, and the pride of an entire navy. Every sailor understood the legacy they carried. Hood was more than steel, she was the symbol of British maritime power, and today, her mettle would be tested in ways none had anticipated. As the German vessels came into view, their silhouettes massive against the grey horizon, the Hood's main guns roared into action. Smoke and fire erupted from her 8 15-inch turrets, a symphony of destruction orchestrated by trained hands and steel nerves. Each shell screamed across the cold Atlantic, aiming to cripple Bismarck before she could strike. Yet the Germans were precise. Every salvo from Bismarck seemed calculated, deliberate, a terrifying ballet of death. The sea shook with explosions, water columns rising around Hood as shells splashed perilously close. Time stretched, moments folding upon each other as sailors braced for impact, knowing that even a single error could be fatal. Then it happened. A flash, a tremor, and a roar unlike any the crew had ever known. One of Bismarck's shells had struck the aft magazine. Hood shuddered violently, a metallic scream echoing through her bulkheads. Fire and smoke engulfed the deck as sailors were thrown into chaos. The immense ship, the pride of the Royal Navy, began to break apart under the force of the explosion. In seconds, the aft section twisted and collapsed, water rushing in to claim the mighty battlecruiser. The speed at which she sank stunned everyone. What had been a symbol of invincibility disappeared beneath icy waves in less time than it took to load another salvo. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, swallowed Hood along with 1,415 souls, leaving only 3 survivors to tell the tale. The survivors' accounts painted a scene of unimaginable horror. One moment, decks echoed with orders and cannon fire. The next, an inferno engulfed the ship, followed by a sudden silence. Bodies and debris were flung into the freezing waters, while those few who remained afloat clung desperately to fragments of what had once been a colossal fortress. Their memories would haunt them forever: the sudden eruption, the towering waves, the cries of comrades, and the endless stretch of grey water where Hood had disappeared. Even after rescue, the psychological scars were indelible. They had witnessed the end of a legend, a reminder that history can pivot in an instant, indifferent to pride or preparation. Back in Britain, news of Hood's demise spread like wildfire. The public, already tense from the ongoing war, reacted with shock and grief. Newspapers carried stark headlines: families prayed for confirmation, only to be met with devastating loss. Admiralty offices erupted into urgent meetings. The destruction of Hood was more than a military setback, it was a national tragedy. The command understood that immediate action was required, not only to avenge the loss but to prevent Bismarck from continuing its deadly campaign against vital Atlantic convoys. Orders were issued, ships mobilized, and aircraft dispatched to locate the German battleship before she could escape into the vast ocean. The hunt for Bismarck became an operation fueled by desperation, determination, and precision. Every available vessel, from cruisers to destroyers, scoured the Atlantic, while reconnaissance planes extended the eyes of the Royal Navy across thousands of miles. Signals intelligence intercepted German communications, allowing British forces to anticipate Bismarck's maneuvers. The loss of Hood had transformed the mission from a defensive patrol into a personal vendetta. The pride of the Royal Navy had been struck down, and no effort would be spared to ensure justice or retribution was exacted. Sailors, officers, and planners understood that the pursuit was about more than strategy, it was about restoring honor and demonstrating resilience in the face of catastrophic loss. 3 days after the sinking, British forces caught up with Bismarck. The final engagement was relentless. Aircraft from the carrier Ark Royal crippled Bismarck's steering with well-aimed torpedoes, rendering her vulnerable. Battleships and cruisers closed in, delivering a coordinated assault that the German crew could neither escape nor withstand. Shells tore through her hull, engines faltered, and finally, Bismarck succumbed to overwhelming force. The death of Hood had catalyzed the destruction of Bismarck, turning tragedy into a tactical victory, but the cost had been seared into the memory of the Royal Navy and the British public. The legacy of HMS Hood extended far beyond her physical destruction. She became a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the impermanence of even the mightiest constructs. Naval academies studied her history meticulously, analyzing her design, the limitations of her armor, and the tactical decisions that defined her final engagement. Hood's story was not simply one of defeat, it was a lesson in strategy, engineering, and human resolve. Her sinking underscored the evolution of naval warfare. Speed, firepower, and reputation were invaluable, yet modern battles demanded adaptability, technological innovation, and coordination across multiple domains. Memorials were erected, and the names of her crew inscribed in stone and memory. Families of the lost sailors found solace in the recognition that their loved ones had served aboard a ship that represented the pinnacle of British naval pride. The wreck itself, lying deep beneath the Atlantic, became hallowed ground, a silent testament to bravery, human endeavor, and the harsh realities of war. Divers and historians who later studied the site marveled at the remains, noting how even in destruction, Hood's form conveyed scale, craftsmanship, and a story frozen in time. Hood's influence also extended into broader naval strategy. Her loss accelerated the development of better armor schemes, changes in fleet tactics, and improvements in gunnery targeting and aerial reconnaissance. Admirals and engineers across the world noted the limitations exposed by her destruction, integrating lessons into the designs of subsequent vessels. In a paradoxical sense, the tragedy of Hood propelled naval innovation, ensuring that her legacy lived on in every ship that sought to avoid her fate. Ultimately, HMS Hood's final chapter became inseparable from the narrative of the Royal Navy in World War II. Her death was mourned, studied, and immortalized, but her spirit endured. Hood had embodied ambition, engineering excellence, and the human capacity for courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Though she sank in the cold waters of the Denmark Strait, her story inspired generations, a reminder that even the mightiest ships and crews are bound by the uncertainty of battle and that true legacy is measured not solely in victories, but in the enduring mark left on history, memory, and the sea itself.